Good evening and welcome to Nottingham Trent University. As I said, I'm Rich Deems. I'm the Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Research and International here at NTU. And it's a real pleasure to invite you all, to welcome you all for this evening's event. And as noted, tonight we think something rather special is happening because it's the first time that NTU has hosted the British Academy lecture. And we think that really matters because the British Academy is the UK's National Academy for the Humanities and Social Sciences. And it brings together some of the most distinguished scholars in the world, funds outstanding research and creates space for ideas that help us understand our societies, our histories, and our futures. And thank you to Sharon, our own BA fellow, who has travelled to London and back again to attend this event. So this event also allows us to talk a little about the strength of the research and innovation and impact in the humanities here at NTU. Even in the last week, we're pleased to receive over £600,000 from the British Academy through two major international partnering awards and also through two of the small awards, which likewise accelerate the careers of our early career researchers and really bring that research to life. So the Academy itself is approaching a remarkable milestone. So in 2027, it will celebrate its quasquicentennial. So you can remember what that says. So that was a little bit of practicing there. That's 125 years of existence. And leadership in the humanities and the social sciences in the UK. And this lecture programme goes back a long way. The British Academy lecture started in 1908. 118 years ago. So we're very pleased and very proud to be opening this programme, which, as Isa said, will also take place in Cardiff, Coventry, Newcastle, Belfast, Bristol, East Anglia, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Leicester, and Manchester. So these British Academy flagship lectures showcase some of the most outstanding scholarship in the humanities and social sciences. They bring together students, researchers, and the wider public to hear about these new ideas, challenge assumptions, and start conversations that we hope will continue after the lecture ends. Tonight's event is part of the L.C. Zetlin Lectures on Chinese Archaeology and Culture, a series established through a bequest by Myrtle Henrietta Zetlin in 2001. The series has been supported lectures that deepen our understanding of Chinese archaeology, art, and music, and the cultures that shaped them. Which brings me to this evening's speaker. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Dorian Fuller, Professor of Archaeobotany and Joint Director of the International Centre of Chinese Heritage and Archaeology at University College London. Professor Fuller studied at Yale before completing his PhD in Cambridge and has taught at UCL since 2000. His fieldwork has taken him across India, Sri Lanka, Sudan, Ethiopia, Morocco, Turkey, Iraq, Myanmar, and China. His research explores some of the most fundamental questions about human history: how plants were domesticated, how agriculture emerged, and how food systems shaped societies. He is a long-respected scholar. He has published more than 400 papers and is recognised through election as a Fellow of the Linnaean Society of London, of which I'm proud to call myself also a Fellow. Tonight's lecture takes us back to Neolithic China, where two very different agricultural worlds emerged. In the north, farmers cultivated hardy millets suited to the dry steppe landscapes, and in the south, the communities developed intensive wet rice agriculture in lush wetlands. Rice agriculture supported dense, sedentary populations and highly organised labour over generations. Millet farming encouraged mobility, diversified crops, and expansion of farmland across wider landscapes. In other words, what people chose to grow did more than just feed them. It helped to shape the societies they became. And with that, please join me in welcoming Professor Dorian Fuller.
Nice to see you all. It's nice to be in Nottingham. I have to say this is my first time at Nottingham Trent University, so it's a pleasure to be here. And I understand that there's a tradition of agricultural research here too, so that sort of perhaps intersects in some way. Okay, so you've been introduced to my topic, and you will realize that I'm an archaeologist and a botanist, so an archaeobotanist. So I work on excavations and I work on plant remains from those excavations. And I'm going to take you through some of the emerging evidence and a kind of synthesis of the emerging evidence from the archaeology in Neolithic China, focusing on both South China, by which I mean the Yangtze Basin, and North China, and you'll see that on maps later. And this essentially is the kind of arguments I will try to develop, so to let you know where we're going. We'll be contrasting the kind of different agricultural ecologies, the different kinds of agricultural landscapes in the North and South, the different domestication trajectories that had some similarities in some aspects, but were really quite different in many other ways. And these then set in place alternative approaches to ways of scaling up. So as human populations grow, you need to feed more people, you need to increase agricultural productivity, and we get two very different strategies in North and South China. These then have implications for how agricultural innovation proceeds in these two areas. So we have different systems of innovation, what I call here affordances, different kind of logics. And that has long-term implications for the nature of demographic change and social evolution in these two parts of China. And I would suggest it kind of sets up different kind of cultural styles, perhaps, that embed themselves over the longer term. And so in this picture, we've got an image of some millet cultivation in Inner Mongolia at the top, and some rice cultivation in Zhejiang province, that's sort of south of Shanghai in southern China, to represent those landscapes. We'll see a lot of versions of those kind of pictures. And in terms of the title, I've talked about the difference between grasslands and wetlands. Of course, rice is a grass, but it's a grass that grows in these wet marshlands. And that ultimately is driven by underlying climatic differences. So if we look at this map here, this is a rainfall map, so obviously it's modern data. Things have shifted a little bit here and there, but the broader pattern hasn't changed, in that the southern areas have heavy rainfall. Those are in millimeters. The northern areas have very light rainfall, and the areas that are sort of in white have less than 300 millimeters. So we tend to think of that as very marginal or even impossible for rain-fed agriculture. And then the hatched areas are the areas where we think the wild progenitors of the millets that are domesticated in North China came from. And you'll see that they straddle the kind of ecotone, the transition from kind of light rainfall, 500, 400 millimeters, to the kind of really dry steppe, less than 300 millimeters. So they come from this kind of marginal transitional zone in terms of rainfall, whereas rice is coming from what we usually think of as called the lower Yangtze Basin, where this arrow is pointing, where you have very high rainfall. And then I've got just sort of these kind of annual cycles of rainfall. So you can see that at its peak, you get at most about 10 centimeters in a month. That's 100 millimeters there in sort of July in the summer, whereas here you have at least that through many, many months, right? So it's very, very different. And again, this kind of represents our two sets of crops, so millets at the top and rice at the bottom. Now, if we zoom out of China, I'll do this a few times, kind of try to put it into a wider context. The domestication of millets in these kind of semi-arid grassland zones, these ecotones of kind of low rainfall between 300 and 500 millimeters annually, is actually fairly typical of the origins of cereal agriculture. So if we look at this map, again, it's the same kind of rainfall map. You can see the Chinese millets there in their zone here. That kind of transition in terms of rainfall is similar to the zones where we have domestication of African millet, sorghum and pearl millet, south of the Sahara, or the semi-arid zones of western and peninsular India, where we have Indian millets being domesticated, or indeed the inner part of what we call the Fertile Crescent in Western Asia, where wheats and barley come from. So it's quite typical for these kind of semi-arid grasslands to lead into cereal farming, and North China is one example of that. And what stands out as quite different is then these kind of wet agricultural systems. And again, we have parallels out in other parts of the world. There's Asian rice, of course, which we're talking about today. And in parts of wetter parts of West Africa, you have an independent African rice domestication. So that's just to give you a bit of kind of further background. Now, those semi-arid zones, which are very rich in grasslands, they're partly rich in grasslands because there isn't that much rainfall, so that you don't get well-developed forests. So a lot of the biomass is highly seasonal. You get these seasonal spurts of rainfall. You get the development of grasslands. Grasslands are full of these annual species that lock up most of that primary productivity of photosynthesis in that seasonal period, and then they die back, and they leave most of that sort of photosynthetic energy either in the seeds that sit out the rest of the year in the dry season, or in their kind of dry leafy parts. That means from a human point of view, you have two strategies for trying to get enough to eat out of these grasslands. One is you either let the herbivores that live in those grasslands process the grasses for you. They can digest the cellulose in leafy bits. So you do that through either as a hunter-gatherer hunting gazelle or deer or whatever, or by herding animals, so kind of agro-pastoral systems. So that's one adaptation to grasslands. The other one is to focus on all that energy that's stored in those grass seeds, and here we've got some foxtail millet and broomcorn millet. These are the two millets that come from China, which we'll talk about today. So all those millets, those grass seeds have all this energy reserve stored in them if you have the technologies to process them and systems for storing them. So these grassland areas have kind of low and unpredictable rainfall, but they have a predictable growing season, which is short, and it stores a lot of that energy then in grains, which are potentially usable. I've mentioned nuts here too, because on the edge of the grassland, as you get patches of woodland, of course, you have lots of trees with potentially also storable nuts. So this is the kind of environment where a lot of cereals are wild, including these millets in North China. Now, one technique for making those grains edible is to develop there's two different kind of main technologies that we see in prehistory. One is either grinding things and the other is boiling things. And we see a very early development of a boiling technology in East Asia and China. So this map here shows some well-known sites, well-known to archaeologists, that have early pottery going back more than 10,000 years. So this is the development of ceramics amongst hunter-gatherer fisher peoples as a method of cooking and processing grains. And we've got some illustrations here from some of these sites like Shuangta, that's about 8,000 BC, and Hotomuga, which will come up again, that's about sort of 9, 10, 11,000 BC. Those are BP is before present. I will try to use BC dates in most of my talk, but sometimes it'll be clear on the slides in any case. So there's this early development of ceramics, and I would refer to that as post-harvest intensification. So after you harvest some plants, this is a method for making them more digestible and more palatable. Now, one of the reasons it's worth noting is one of the things that's distinctive about China, if we compare it to, say, Western Asia or the Near East, is the early development of boiling technologies and early development of pottery. So this is, again, if we step out a little bit and think about trajectories into agricultural lifeways, we can think about the relative timing of when do people settle down and develop villages, represented here by the houses. When do people start cultivating things, represented by the people cultivating? When do they domesticate animals? And when do they develop ceramics? And if we look at the bottom here, this is Western Asia, the Near East, ceramics are really an afterthought. Villages come first, then cultivation, then domestication of wheat and barley, domestication of sheep and goat, and pottery comes thousands of years after that. So they do that all really on a grinding and flour-making technology, grinding stones. No interest in boiling things until much later. Whereas if we look at some parts of Africa, but for today, North and South China, ceramics are really, really early. So they have a boiling technology that allows them, that opens up one method of taking advantage of those grassland resources. Okay, so what about the southern wetlands contrast? So here we are now in southern China. These are all pictures in Zhejiang province, what we usually refer to as the lower Yangtze. So for those of you kind of familiar with Chinese geography, this is the capital city of the province is Hangzhou, and it's to the south of Shanghai. And you can see these lots of low-lying wet environments, lots of wetlands. Of course, there are mountains with forests and forest resources as well. So the thing to realize is you get high monsoonal rainfall, high seasonal flooding, often reasonably predictable, high stable water availability. This means there's lots of aquatic resources. So these archaeological sites, we see lots of use of fish, for example. We've got a nice picture of carp there, carp and crucian carp and snakehead fish, and aquatic plant resources. This is the Chinese water chestnut, or one of the water chestnuts, which is an aquatic nut. And then in the trees you have potentially lots of edible fruits and nuts. But this is also an environment in which, in some of those wetland areas, wild rice was native. Now we're gonna now kind of walk through the story of how rice agriculture emerges and is domesticated in this part of China, and looking at what the archaeological evidence that story is based on, and then we'll go back to the north later. So I'll start here at a site called Tenlo Shan, which some of these pictures are when it's under excavation initially in 2004, and then the subsequent work there in 2006 and 2007. And this is really one of the first archaeological projects I collaborated on with Chinese colleagues and I spent quite a bit of time on the site doing the archaeobotanical work in 2006 and 2007. So we're going to start there partly because my own journey with rice starts there in a way, but also because it's a nice illustrated site and it will provide us some comparisons with more recent data. So if we look at the site, you can see where it's located. It was discovered by accident as this kind of barn was being built. If you go there now, there's a site museum and a lot of the site has been conserved. This is it under its sort of site museum dome. It's low-lying, it's below the modern water table, so we get the lucky circumstances of what archaeologists refer to as waterlogged preservation, which means you get good organic preservation, including wooden posts here from the posts of kind of houses built on stilts, and you get excellent plant remain preservation that creates its own sort of challenges. Amongst things there's a lot of on the site are these pits. You can see one in the cross-section here, a storage pit. Here's one from above, and these pits are full of acorns, so nuts of oak trees. So the staple food actually seems to be acorns at this point in time, but there's also a large quantity of rice, as we'll see. And so it provided an opportunity to kind of explore systematic archaeobotanical sampling on a site like this and really look at what is the balance of wild foods, cultivated foods, and what is the status of rice on this site. And what we found is that there's kind of what I would refer to as 4 co-staples, things that occur in high frequency, high quantity, and recur across the site in lots of different kinds of archaeological contexts. And those are acorns, by far the most common plant remain on the site, trepa, the water chestnut, or lingjiao in Chinese, and then also this thing, another aquatic nut, this one here, the fox nut, or chin shu, which is another starchy aquatic nut that grows in the wetlands there, and then rice. So if we look at this graph, this is in terms of items per liter. We've got acorns, trepa, urali, these are all starchy nuts, and here's rice. So the kind of 4 co-staples. There's also a nice diversity of fruits in much lower quantities, so things that are gathering from the forest, wild peaches and wild kiwi fruits and persimmons and wild grapes and blackberries. So it's a very rich environment. This site is also full of fish bones and hunted deer and things like that. Now, one of the reasons this site was exciting is back in the 1970s, Chinese archaeologists had discovered a site called Hemudu, just a few miles from this site. And that site was quite famous for having houses built on stilts, and these are reconstructions of what those houses might have looked like. And having bone tools interpreted as spades. So these are what these sort of look like here. These are actually ones from Tenlo Shan, and of course ceramic. So it's the same culture, but in the 1970s when the excavations were first carried out, they didn't have the same kind of sampling methods that we would use today to recover the plant remains. So this allowed us to test some of the ideas that had been put forward in the 1970s and look at the data in new ways. And this is just a much later picture showing how some of these kind of spades might have been used. We have both the kind of what we might think of as a proper spade, more like a hoe really, and things that are these kind of ones that are intentionally split. And this is one of these lay type split spades for working with soil. So I was particularly interested in rice domestication. So how do we track domestication of a plant? So step back a little bit and think a little bit about plant biology. In the wild, of course, grasses, any plant wants to disperse their seeds, so they get pollinated, they develop seeds, and those seeds get dispersed in some way. So in wild rice and most of the grasses, it happens through a process of shattering. So you've got a panicle, lots of grains contained in little spikelets, and they come off. So here I am holding a wild rice the panicle. You can see there's one grain here lying on my finger. A lot of these have fallen off already. So what happens is as the grains mature, which might take place over several weeks, they fall off and they fall down into the muck and the mud and they disperse themselves. And they have really long, what's called an awn, these really long structures that come off, spindly structures that come off the top, which are covered with hooks, and those actually add buoyancy. So it's proven that if they fall into water, they will float because of this long awn, and the wild rice will just coast down on the current. So they're very good at dispersing themselves. What happens with domesticated plants is they lose the ability to disperse their own seeds. So the little structures that allow each of those grains to fall off stop forming, or they misform. You get a mutation that causes them to not shatter. And then they sit on the plant. And so here's some domesticated rice. And again, the grains are getting heavy. They're filling. They're not falling off. They're sitting there waiting for a human to come through and harvest it. So they become reliant on humans for planting them. So part of their reproductive cycle relies on humans. So this is a fundamental change that happens in all the domesticated cereals. And it's one that we can potentially track archaeologically, because if we find this little structure where that arrow is, you get a smooth scar in the wild type, and in the domesticated ones that have been harvested and processed by people, you get a ripped, it's physically ripped through threshing. So that's what that looks like. So these are archaeological examples, both from Tenlo-Shan. So from that site, we were able to recover thousands of, about 2,600 of these rice spikelet bases, and I was able to separate them under the microscope into the different types and count them up and track and find that we had a mixture, and so we were able to track sort of rates of evolution in this trait. And these pictures below just show how that then relates back to human practices and harvesting methods. So this is some experimental work we did with colleagues in Eastern India, harvesting wild rice. So this is a rice navarre, simply using a basket, a couple of baskets like this, and you simply paddle it off. Because it shatters naturally, you can just paddle it off. So 5 minutes, you can fill a basket with rice grains. A lot of them are not fully filled, but it's quite an efficient way to harvest. So hunter-gatherers would have been doing this before agriculture. With domesticated rice, you need to come up with other ways of making it efficient, things like developing tools like sickles. The other way we can track domestication is to look at grain size. So the grains in domesticated cereals are larger, they're fatter. They're not really longer, they're fatter. And this just shows this here, the wild rice is this red one, it's kind of skinny. The domesticated one is both white and fat. Color is another interesting trait, but that's a discussion for another time, that evolves early on in domestication in the case of rice. And this, again, we think is driven primarily by competition in cultivated fields. So if you imagine you've cleared your field and you've scattered a bunch of rice grains. As those grains germinate, all those little seedlings are competing with each other. And so the fatter grain has more food reserves in it, therefore its seedling germinates faster, it gets its roots down deeper, it gets its leaves up quicker, which means it gets more soil resources, that's nutrients and water, and more sunlight, quicker than its neighbors, its cousins and siblings that have skinnier grains and weaker seedlings. And so this sets in process an unconscious from the human point of view, but a selection process from the plant's point of view for increasing grain size. And so that's something else we can track archaeologically very easily. So I'm going to look at both of these traits as domestication traits. In rice, now I'm going to step back and put the data from Tenlo-Shan, where we first looked at this about 20 years ago now, in the context of a lot of other sites that have been worked on since then by some by students of mine, some by Chinese colleagues, some by their students, and so forth. So it's kind of, there's been a lot of research in the last 20 years on this topic. And on the right we have a graph of grain size. So this is grain width, so how fat the grains are. So for each different site, you have the average and the standard deviation, because of course there's variation. And then they're plotted against the median age. So you take the dates for the site and say, what's the middle part of the occupation of the site? And you can see that there's this gradual trend of rice getting fatter over time. But starting before this is 6,000 BC, 1,000 BC. So they're gradually getting fatter. This just takes the average and turns it into a percentage increase. So you can see sort of clearly the trend of what percentage growth in area is there in the rice over time. And I've shaded that bit just before 4,000 BC, because domestication, we think, is definitely done by then. It's possibly happening earlier. And then the graph up above is an updated graph on non-shattering. So that's taking those spikelet bases and saying, what proportion are these wild types what proportion of these domesticated types. We get some that could go either way, which I think are green harvested, these immature ones, some that are damaged, we can't tell. That gives us a kind of error margin, right? So we don't really know, are all these wild or all of them domesticated? The truth is somewhere in between. So it gives us, again, an error margin. So that's what's represented here. So we've got the kind of estimate of the domesticated percentage with the error margin, and then a maximum possible domesticated and minimum possible domesticated. In the Tenlo-Shan, that first site I worked on, is 3 of these triangles here. It showed this sort of gradual increase, sort of halfway through the process. There's now a lot more data from more sites in different subregions of China. That's what this sort of map shows. And what it suggests to me is that, A, these processes are slow. We realize that already. So there's a kind of longer-term trend from essentially wild-type shattering down here to domesticated non-shattering up here. But there's some different regional processes. So there's probably parallel evolution, parallel domestication processes taking part in different parts of China. The lower Yangtze region, the middle Yangtze. There's another river here called the Huai River. A lot of these ones that are up here are from the Huai and Han River. So they're kind of a little bit precocious, perhaps, in terms of evolution of this trait. But we can see that there's not an event where suddenly rice is domesticated, but it's a gradual evolutionary process as the rice is adapting to being cultivated and spread by people, and it's getting more efficient at being planted by humans. The other thing to note is that these 2 different traits are evolving at different rates. So if we think of these are kind of mostly domesticated here, we're still about halfway through the grain size trajectory. So that continues to increase and kind of improve the grain size through time. That's an important thing to hold on to, because we'll come back to that. Because that also affects both of these things affect the yield that people get out of their rice fields. But the grain size continuing to evolve is an important one. Now, on that previous graph, you may have noticed that the far left, where there had very low proportions of non-shattering, was labeled Shangshan. So some of our earliest sites now in Zhejiang province are what's now known as the Shangshan culture. This site of Shangshan and the name of this culture was only discovered in 2000, so it's very much a 21st century archaeological discovery, and most of the kind of exciting archaeological work on this culture has been done really in the last decade, and there's been a lot of activity, and it's ongoing, and there's a lot of unpublished material and so forth. So it's a very exciting time to work on these Shangshan sites. This is in southern Zhejiang province, and where you've got these kind of smaller rivers and river tributaries and these nice wetland valleys, and the sites are located on the kind of where the side tributaries come into the larger rivers, which would have been large kind of wetland areas, and it's associated with some of the earliest, you can see it on the map here, some of the earliest ceramics so far in this part of the world, which again go back to about 9.5, maybe 10,000 years ago, so about 7,500 BC, we think. In some of this pottery, when they make the ceramics, they're using the chaff from rice that they've processed to temper the pottery. And so one clever approach to looking for evidence for early rice domestication is to look inside the pottery itself using micro-CT scanning as a technique, which is being done now in Hangzhou at Zhejiang University, this work. And you can see when you do that, you can use the X-ray image, the micro-CT X-ray tomography to pull out the individual rice spikelets bases and look at whether they're wild or domesticated types. And so this study here, just a couple of years ago, is showing very high proportions of the wild shattering type, small amounts of the kind of domesticated type. So this is very much at the very beginning of that kind of process. When we look at these sites, we can also get a sense of what the first movement towards something like a sedentary village looked like in this part of the world. They're occupying these low-lying, as I say, in these kind of low-lying valleys where a couple of river channels are coming together. They're surrounded by water and wetland, and they're clearly manipulating that. So here's a plan of the site called Shatong, which is currently under excavation by the Zhejiang province. So, and you've got a kind of mound here. That mound is partly natural, it's partly artificial. So they're building up and putting more soil and clay on this mound, which they're then digging pits into and building their houses on. And they're also creating a ditch system. In fact, I think they now think there's a second ditch. So there's 2 ring ditches around the site. So they're digging those things out. These are places to kind of, it'll prevent flooding in the mound. It'll give you earth to put up on your mound. It also gives you a place where you can do things like processing. The ditch here is full of these these pits here, which I think are probably leaching pits. So if you collect all your acorns, they've got a lot of tannin in them, so you soak them in pits in water to get the tannins out. So they're using it for that. It also means you have water that you can use to make sure your rice is well watered, etc. Their tools, we have these digging stick stone weights. So these are stone weights you would use at the top of a digging stick for digging holes, possibly for making fields, but probably also mainly for digging those post holes for houses. So they're creating kind of long-term settlement spaces, very much about, in these wetland environments, are very much about manipulating where water goes and where it doesn't go. So you keep your water in your ditch and not up on your settlement site here. And then if we look at where we have, this again is going a bit forward in time again, back to Tinlo-Shan. So TLS is that Tinlo-Shan site. These are some later sites in the region. If we look at what is occurring alongside the rice, what we would now call the weed flora, so what's growing with the rice, that gets harvested by mistake, and it ends up in our archaeobotanical samples, we can say something about the ecology of cultivation. And what we see very clearly in these early sites is it's very much a wet rice ecology. So it's an irrigated wet rice ecology. It's not a rain-fed upland rice system. They have a very different weed flora. And so we see that through these wetland weeds that occur in wetlands. And this just shows these three different families. Sedges tend to be wet, knotweeds often wet. Some grasses are wet, some are not. And some of the work we did at UCL in the last decade, we had a series of grants working on what are called phytoliths. These are microscopic plant silica skeletons, so little microfossils formed in the leaves of plants. They look like that under the microscope. And these we can tell apart broad plant groups like grasses and sedges. And we came up with an index for how wet the environment was. We did a lot of work in modern rice and wild rice fields in India and Thailand and South China to develop this index. And so this is our kind of wet-dry index. And you can see that most of these early sites are up in this kind of higher than 1 zone, which has a kind of very wet environmental signature. And a few sites, later sites, have a kind of drier signature. These ones, Mahagara is in Cote d'Ivoire. These are Indian sites. So early Indian rice is rain-fed, early Chinese rice is kind of irrigated is the way to think about that. But this just tells us that we're dealing with a wetland environment. At slightly later periods, we start to find our first kind of field systems. So this is at about 4000 BC at sites like Chodun, shown here, or Shaoshui-Shan. Another site I had the opportunity to help do some of the sampling on in 2008 when it was, there was a rescue excavation there. This site is now underneath the high-speed rail line. If you take the high-speed train from Shanghai to Beijing, it goes right through the site. When they were building that rail line, there was some rescue archaeology in April of 2008. And luckily, I was spending that Easter in Beijing, so I was able to go down and help with some of the archaeobotany there. In any case, what you have is these very small field systems, just a few meters across. These are these little dugout fields, so they're dug into the natural subsoil, and then they're filled with these very rich wetland soils where they're growing rice. They're probably manuring them with kitchen waste because you get small bits of potsherds and ash and charcoal and things in them. And this is where they're growing rice in the early days. So these very small fields. And these are examples here again, these very small fields. So they're kind of tightly controlled. They're kind of micromanaging water and soil conditions for rice at this point. And this is how we think that's kind of working. So here's a kind of reconstruction of the fields as they're cleared and they're sown, and then they're flooded, and you've got the early growth of rice. And then what we think they're doing is they're kind of draining the water as the rice comes into its flowering phase, because that's going to increase productivity. So one of the other challenges that I didn't mention yet, rice is a very weird crop in that its ancestor is a perennial grass, which means if it's growing in nice water, what it likes to do is keep growing. It produces more roots and more leaves and not a lot of grain. It tends to produce grain as a response to kind of drought stress. So if the rice plant thinks it's running out of water, it will put more effort into producing grains. And this is one of the ways I think that they convince it to do that. So by micromanaging the water, you can, as it's starting to flower, you can drain it out, drain the system out, and it will produce more grains as a response to that. Eventually that gets genetically fixed, that gets selected again for genetic change, and if you grow domesticated rice today, of course it will always produce lots of grain. It's an annual species, but its ancestor is a perennial. And this is with a colleague in India studying some perennial wild rice in India, where again it's growing in deep water, it produces lots of leaves, lots of roots, not so many grains. So it's not a very good grain producer. So one of the reasons for these small fields is people are really putting that labor-intensive effort into making these small fields, controlling the water, controlling the growth environment for the rice to coax it into increasing productivity. Now, eventually the genetic change does take place and you get truly annualized rice, and then it will always produce grains, and you don't need to manipulate the water in that way, and then you can scale up. And we see that at a site called Naoshan. And this is just in the suburbs of Hangzhou City. Again, this is a rescue excavation. You can see this huge excavation site. These are all tall apartment blocks and condos now. But in 2009, 2010, there was a big rescue project there. And this paleo soil here, this black earth here, this is the ancient soil surface of paddy fields, of rice paddy fields. And so we have huge field systems with drier embanked walkways running between them. And this is a kind of basically a landscape of rice production. So here's a plan of it. There's a cemetery up here, and there's some houses up in this area. The cemetery in red here, there's some house structures up here. But you've got these field systems with these long linear embankments. So here's a kind of reconstruction of what that looks like. So this is like a rice field system as we might be more familiar with today. Here's a photograph of a similar kind of system in eastern India. So embankments between fields that are flooded. So really increasing productivity, because now the rice is annualized, so you can increase productivity by increasing that water that's going in there. The water suppresses weeds and improves rice productivity. And this field system comes in at about 2500 BC, 2600 BC. So we would think of that as really the end of a process by which time you've got really intensive rice agriculture as we might almost recognize it today. Alongside this, at the site of Naoshan is what's called the Liangju culture period. We also get the evolution of all the technologies that go with the rice. So technologies of harvesting, technologies of soil preparation and plowing, and that's just illustrated here. So you get the gradual development of these kind of foot plows. They don't have traction animals to pull them yet, but these kind of stone plow tips that are probably being used by a couple of people. And these are then harvest knives and sickles for harvesting the rice. So there's this increasing investment in the technologies of agricultural production to make it more and more efficient in this period. Now, the reason I've emphasized the importance of realizing it's wet rice is that has a huge implication for the nature of land use and the nature of land productivity. And this just kind of shows some ethnographic and historical data on kind of yield, so the productivity per hectare, so the amount of kilograms of rice you get per hectare in rain-fed rice systems. And these are the kind of upland systems that you might see in parts of India or Southeast Asia. Here's an upland Sweden of slash and burn agriculture with hill rice being grown in Laos, for example. Here's one in eastern India where it's simply being broadcast on the floodplain, and as the floods recede, you get this kind of dry grassland of rice. Those yields are on the low side, so they're 500, less than 500 kilograms, less than a ton per hectare. Whereas your traditional wet rice yields are many times higher. And so the advantage of irrigated rice is it's a lot of work to manage the landscape, to create these systems, to have the tools for plowing the soil, even for transplanting rice seedlings, which we don't know exactly when that develops, but sometime in the 3,000 years ago or 2,500 years ago, they probably start doing this as well to increase that rice productivity. So it takes a lot more work, but you get a lot more return per unit area. And so this is just that contrast between wet and dry rice, but we'll see an even bigger contrast with the millets when we move north. So if we think about the evolution of rice again, and we think about how it relates back to how people are using the landscape and the returns that they're getting for their labor efforts, there is a kind of progression of increased productivity that goes alongside the domestication process. The graph at that top is a kind of stretched version of that graph of average grain size. So as grains are getting thicker, that means there's more calories per grain, and the production systems mean you're getting more grains per hectare. So the grains are both getting fatter, so you're getting more productivity from that, and then you're getting more grains per hectare through time. And so we can kind of start to make some estimates of the kinds of yields we're talking about. That means you can support a lot of people. And the kind of end of that trajectory or the kind of pinnacle of that initial trajectory in Zhejiang province is what's known as the Liangzhu culture. Some people might have heard of this site. It's now a World Heritage Site. So here's a plan of the Liangzhu landscape. There's a huge kind of central city. It's not like a sort of city that we think of from the Near East or something. It's a series of mounds, artificial mounds, with canals in between, and it's got a big city wall, which is entered again through canals. So it's kind of like some sort of a Neolithic Venice kind of thing, with this kind of fortified, entered by canals, in this low-lying wetland landscape where they're clearly managing water. So this area here is all of these artificial dams that are preventing flooding coming down from the mountains, and there's a very large high dam up here, which I've got a picture of here. So this actually mound is artificial. It's this high dam, which is built around 2500 BC. And when you go into the bit that's preserved under this kind of museum, you can see how it's been built up. It's kind of sort of like they think it's kind of basket-wrapped sort of sacks of earth. The basketry is decomposed. And along with that, you get a social hierarchy, you get craft production with these very fine jades and very fine ceramics. So this kind of early civilization is then built on this kind of landscape of highly productive rice. That's the sort of bottom line. And yeah, so the bit inside here is about 290 hectares of space within this kind of central city wall. There's a plan of it. And what's interesting is we were doing some calculations on what we think the productivity might have been for this early rice, and then how much land you need to feed people if we take the size of different Neolithic sites. So if we just take Tenloshan at the top, that's that first site I worked on. It's about a 3-hectare site. It's probably about 50 people per hectare, so about 150 people. It's not a very big site in modern terms, but for the Neolithic, that's a reasonable sedentary population. And then this is a kind of a range of estimates for how much rice they need to eat, assuming it's 2/3 of the diet or 80% of the diet. And then depending on what you assume your yield is, you got another sort of range of estimates. But the kind of median is for that 3-hectare site, you need about 24 hectares of rice, plus or minus, or between 18 and 30 hectares. And that's about 8 hectares. That's about 1/8 of a hectare, 0.16 hectares per person, right? Anyways, if you scale those up, so that's here, that's what you need for a 1-hectare site. If you scale that up and say how many hectares are there within a day's walk of a site, you get a population estimate of about 14,000 you could support, and that ends up being a site of about 280 hectares. That's the first cities at Liangzhu. So that's essentially could all be supported within walking distance of rice fields, that sort of scale of population. Okay, so we're going to leave those numbers aside. We'll come back to them for comparison. I want to take you now north, back to the dry steppes in northern China. So here's a map. This is where our millets are wild. This is the wild progenitor of foxtail millet, the green foxtail there. The wild progenitor of the panica millet is kind of lost. It persists only as a kind of weedy form that's hybridized with the crop that occurs as an agricultural weed, but it gives us, so it doesn't have good natural habitats, but we have some idea of what it looked like. And this is the zone where we think that these things were occurring. And this is the kind of more desertic steppe. This is the more woodland zone, and they're in this kind of ecotone between the woodland and the steppe. And one of the things to note about this environment, which I mentioned before, is that it's highly variable year on year. So the number of years you have a drought versus the number of years that have reliable rainfall is variable and sort of unpredictable. And we can see that in various data sets. And what this data set shows, the letters here correspond to where they are on the map, roughly. So if we look at particularly A, which is here, and B, which is up here, so framing this kind of area, these fluctuate a lot. And what these are reconstructions of how much rainfall there was in a given year from tree rings. So you can take modern trees and drill them out. So this is obviously the year 2000, and going back to 1600, so the last few hundred years. That just gives you a sense of the variability. I mean, if you look at this is out here in Inner Mongolia, much drier, but much more stable, sort of stably dry. But if you look at these two here, A and B, a lot of interannual variability. So the resources are available and they're patchy, but there's a lot of unpredictability year on year. This is going to create, for hunter-gatherers living in this environment, a lot of necessary mobility. People are going to be moving around. They're not going to be settled in one place. They're going to have to be flexible in their systems for getting resources. The other characteristic of this region is that we have what's called the Loess Plateau, and that's a particular kind of soil. And these are some shots of the Loess Plateau. That's this kind of yellowish sand. That sand was created in glacial periods where the ice ages, glacials kicked up all this fine dust and sand, and it blew south of the glaciers and was then deposited. We have Loess deposits in, say, northern Germany and northern France and so forth. But there's this massive plateau across northern China of these Loess deposits. Then in a warmer period, as we're occupying now, the glaciers have melted and these soils are available. Now these soils have a lot of rich mineral content, but that mineral content is locked away. So it needs water. It needs lots of water to release that mineral content. So they're potentially rich agricultural soils, and some of the richer agricultural soils in sort of Central Europe on Loess soils. But they need water. But as we've seen, that this is an area where water is often quite scarce. So in terms of thinking about where people might cultivate millets, we need to appreciate that there's climate change involved. So this is some reconstructions of where the woodlands are versus the kind of true dry steppe based on pollen data. So these are pollen cores from lakes and other sites in China being mapped at different time horizons. And the really dark blue bits are where you have 10% of oak pollen. The hatched blues are 5% oak pollen. So you're kind of close to the woodlands. And we're really interested in that kind of ecotonal margin, that kind of 5% in transition to grassland, as the right habitat for these wild millets in the past. So if we take those reconstructions, we can think where should we be looking at different time periods for people who are going to be exploiting these millets and might be starting to cultivate them. So this, again, maps the Loess Plateau. And what we find is our early Neolithic cultures associated with millet cultivation tend to be focused on different parts of the Loess Plateau and at that kind of ecotonal boundary. And we're looking at the period of around 8,000 years ago, 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, so 6,000 BC and a bit after, and maybe slightly before, as our kind of key period for millet cultivation beginning. And this is what's been referred to as a kind of hilly flanks model. So they're not interested in the river valleys, they're not focused on the river valleys, but in these upland Loess Plateau areas where you have some mixture of grassland and woodland and enough rainfall to carry out millet agriculture. So again, we can ask, what are hunter-gatherers doing? What are the wild foods that are available to them, and how do the millets compare to those? And again, in the last few years, in the last decade in particular, there's been growth in archaeobotanical evidence in this region. So I'll just give you a few examples of sites. So here's the site of Hotamuga, which I mentioned had a very early ceramics. I mentioned that in an earlier slide. In the earliest level with those early ceramics, there are no millets. We have some wild chenopodds, we have some knotweeds, we have some aquatic nut again, the urale. So they're collecting some wild foods, they're doing a bit of fishing, hunting, gathering river shellfish, and so forth. In a later phase of the site, again after 6,000 BC, is when we start to find small quantities of millet. And also wild soybean, but they're a kind of small component. So they're gathering various seeds and nuts and things that are available. They might be starting to cultivate millets, but on a very small scale, and the likelihood is they're not really living in this site year-round. Slightly later, after 6,000 BC, it is when we start to find sites that have houses that look like might have permanent occupation. And so a couple of examples of sites in northeast China are Jiajiago and Taichi-Yingji, and these were excavated in 2015, I guess, as part of a collaboration between Jilin University, which is in the northeast of China, and an Israeli team, so a Sino-Israeli project, but the archaeobotany was done in London. So someone from my lab went out and collected the samples. Again, they're not particularly rich compared to our early rice sites, but we have an interesting mix of things like wild nuts, wild walnuts and hawthorns and wild apricots, something called the Amur cork tree, which produces a quasi-edible fruit, but they seem to like it, and small amounts of millets. Not huge amounts, but small amounts of millets that look kind of like they're starting to undergo a domestication process. Another site of a similar kind of age, Xinglonghua, shown here, is a very large excavation area where you can see each of these little sunken floors of these little square houses. So we have clear evidence for the construction of these houses. And again, here, some of the houses had millet grains, some didn't, and there's some evidence that they're eating some of the millet from the isotopes of human bones. And then there's one site that's earlier that's got millet, which is this site called Donghulin. It's not far from Beijing. It doesn't have houses, so it's just a kind of probably a seasonal occupation, but it's got a mixture of various small-seeded things, including wild foxtail millet and some grains that look kind of plump, like they're starting to change shape from the wild form, getting a bit fatter. And then recently, there's a site called Sitai, again up in the north of China, and which again has a lot of these square sunken floor houses. The earliest phase, multiple phases, the earliest phase has no millet. The second phase, after about 6,000 BC, starts to have, after about 5,600 BC, starts to have evidence for some millets as well as nutshells. So we're getting a sense that people are using woodland resources, nuts and things, gathering small seeds, including some cultivation of millet in this area. So how do we look at millet domestication? Now, ideally, I'd love to have lots of the spikelet bases that we have in rice, but that structure in millet is very, very small and doesn't seem to survive archaeologically very well. We've had very poor luck recovering them, so they're just not there in quantity. So we have to fall back on our other trait, which is grain size. So again, grains will get fatter through the domestication process, and if we think of half of that in rice, half of that grain size increase takes place alongside the initial domestication. The other half takes place early on after that. We can take that sort of model and apply it to the millet. So we've got two millets. We've got foxtail millet and broomcorn millet. In Chinese, that's su and shu, right? They're two different millets. And these are their grain sizes plotted against time again. So you've got this Donghulin that I mentioned. It's got two size groups here. And then these are much later periods where they're definitely domesticated. And here's your Panicum sequence here. This then takes those averages. Again, it's just a percentage increase in the average over time. And if we say about 50%, it's right here. It falls in this period between 6,000 and 5,000 BC. So this period where we're starting to see houses, we're starting to see people using millet, that seems to be at some kind of key juncture where domestication is taking place. Associated with those cultures is evidence for cultivation tools. So things like these stone spades that you get at a number of these, not all of these sites, but some of the sites in this period turn these up. So it suggests that people are starting to invest in cultivation. Now, as they settle down and domesticate millets, they're not just interested in the millets, they're interested in other stuff too. And so two other species that interestingly are undergoing change in this period in North China are pigs and dogs. So I know this is a lecture about plants, but it's worth mentioning pigs and dogs. And they play an important part in this story also. So the way archaeozoologists tend to look for domestication in animals is change in size again, but animals tend to get smaller. So wild boar are big, domesticated pigs, early domesticated pigs are smaller. And so you can measure their teeth, and as their teeth get smaller, their heads are getting smaller, their bodies are getting smaller. So here's average and distribution of average and standard deviation for pig teeth. And this is the third molar of pigs, so it's all the same tooth in the Yellow River Valley against time. So you can see that they're getting gradually smaller, starting in this period between 6,000 and 5,000 BC. The other thing we can look at is what they're eating. So millets are curious in that they're what's called a C4 grass. I don't want to go into too much detail on it, but they stick out away from rice and many other plants in terms of how they do photosynthesis. And that leaves us an isotopic signature in the carbon isotopes in millet plants, which means people who eat millets will have a higher carbon isotope ratio, carbon-13 ratio, and then also animals that eat a lot of millets. And so we see a shift in isotopes. And you see this shift here in the dogs. So minus 20 is a kind of minus 20 is a typical kind of C3. That means they're maybe not the dogs themselves. The dogs are eating deer that are eating your typical plants. Whereas if they're eating millets, it's going to be around minus 10. Or if they're eating meat of things that are eating millets, right? But in any case, you see this isotopic shift in dogs towards a millet diet, and you see this shift also in pigs. Now, I don't think either dogs or pigs are going to go out and forage on millet on their own. What that tells us is that they're eating human kitchen scraps, what the people are leaving behind, and people are eating millets, right? So these are both markers for what is around the household waste, the household rubbish, the leftovers, even what goes into the human latrine, right, that the pigs might be grubbing through and eating. So they're starting to get a pick up a millet signature. And that's another important part about this. This tells us about sedentism. So as people become sedentary millet farmers, they surround themselves with a household community that includes pigs and dogs, which are living in those households and eating kitchen scraps, which include millets. That also works against mobility, right? So if you think one strategy is to have agropastoralism with your sheep and goat and move around the grasslands. If you have pigs and dogs, you're not moving around the grasslands. You're staying in your, pigs and these kind of dogs, you're staying in your households. And of course, that is a very much a characteristic of the kind of vision of what a house means in kind of some parts of later Chinese culture, where we've got this Han Dynasty, so about 2,000 years ago, model of a courtyard with pigs in it. So, and in fact, I think the Chinese character for home is a pig under a roof, right? So this is very much embedded in the culture. So if we then look at millet, so we've got a period now when millets are starting to be cultivated, where we've got these first houses between 6 and 5,000 BC. After that, millet agriculture spreads, and it spreads wide and it spreads fast. And so these are maps just tracking archaeological occurrences of these two different millets. And you can see they focus in the Yellow River region and the steppe plateau, and a bit on the kind of Tibetan plateau edge. Not so much down here, because of course down here in the south you have rice farmers. So you get some adoption of millets by rice farmers, but essentially where there is rice, millets fear to tread, or millet farmers fear to tread, because you've already got rice farmers. They also develop harvesting tools, so these hand harvest knives seem to develop about 5,000 BC as a method for harvesting millets. And you get the development of small villages. So I just give you some examples of these round houses in early villages. The other thing that happens amongst millet cultivators is diversification. So unlike in the south where it's all about rice, up here it's all about how do you diversify beyond millets. So they domesticate things like cannabis, both for drugs and for oil seeds and eventually for fiber. So hemp, soybean, and eventually they adopt wheat. They don't domesticate wheat, but wheat comes from the west and it enters China about 2200 BC, and it becomes incorporated in the millet system. So this is just a map of early occurrences of wheat in the central plains of China. Early occurrences meaning older than 1000 BC. And this just shows the kind of ratio of wheat to millet, wheat to foxtail millet in these sites based on different ways of calculating that ratio. But you can see that wheat comes in, but it's pretty minor compared to millet, if you look at the lower graph, until the kind of Bronze Age, what's called the Shang Dynasty. So something like 1500 BC, and then wheat takes off. A word about soybean. So soybean is a later domesticated of North China, probably focused on the lower middle Yellow River. So this is Henan province and Shandong province. These squares are the early occurrences of soybean. Again, we can track its domestication by measuring soybean size. So soybeans get bigger. This is soybean seed width over time. And the seed coat on the soybean gets thinner. So that's another nice domestication trait. That means they lose dormancy. They're easier to germinate, easier to grow as crops. And these are some measured seed coat thicknesses in soybean thickness. This again just puts that on a timeline. Here's your overall increase in rice grain size we saw from the lower Yangtze. From the Yangtze, here's the increase in seed size in the millets here. And here's soybean. So soybean is domesticated much later as an addition to millet agriculture. Hemp is another fun one that, of course, is coming out of this part of the world. It diversifies in China into a variety of different uses. Of course, we know cannabis for its, let's say, its medicinal and narcotic properties. We also know it as an important fiber crop. It also has an edible oily seed. These tend to be different varieties, whether they have more or less cannabinoids and THC and so forth, and that's a selection that's all taking place in kind of the later Neolithic of China. So this is one attempt to kind of look at the evolution of these things and try to date it, because you get different seed sizes in the druggy stuff, which is small, and the fiber and oilseed stuff, which is large. But what's I've labeled there Yanghua, which is about 5000 BC, which has large oilseed type already present. So it tells us that is already present. And this, again, is kind of embedded in early Chinese writing. So the word for hemp is ma, shown here. It's just simply a couple of these plants drying, right? And then it gets used as a radical for all sorts of things. So the word for magic and the word for numbness all has that character in it. And that tells us a little bit about the use of the kind of drug component of it. But we also have words for the oilseed form and so forth. Okay. Now, one of the reasons this crop diversity is important is millet productivity tends to reduce the soil nutrients. And so one of the ways to adapt to that is to have systems of fallow or systems of crop rotation. Now, soybeans are great because they fix nitrogen, as any agronomist will tell you. And so if you rotate your beans and your cereals, the beans help to restore soil fertility. But actually, both cannabis and wheat make good rotations with millets because they have different root depths, which I've tried to show here. So millet root depths are kind of 60 centimeters or so. Wheat and hemp, it's like 180 or 200 centimeters, so 2 meters, which means they're using a different part of the soil. So if you grow your millet, it uses up the soil nutrients up here. The next year you could grow wheat and hemp, and they use the soil nutrients down here. And then off in the third years, you use soybean, which helps to kind of restore some of the nutrients. Or you have a fallow year. So it's clear that in order to increase millet productivity, you need to have crop rotations and fallow systems. When we get to the very first written sources, in the kind of first traditional written texts and sources, things like the Book of Documents, which is about kind of a traditional history about the Bronze Age, or the Book of Odes, I think the written sources are collected in maybe the 6th century BC, but they come from earlier periods. They refer to, in the millet world, classifying 3 different kinds of soils based on the year of the fields. They talk about green manures. They talk about crop rotation. So this becomes a way of dealing with productivity in the millet world. And this is up in Inner Mongolia, a picture I took, and I realized that they're still doing this. So here's a strip of soybean, a strip of fallow, another strip of soybean, and a strip of foxtail millet and broomcorn millet. And then there'll be another strip. So you can see this landscape is striped because they're leaving some soil to rest and they're moving the fields around. So it's a very, very different kind of system than what we see in the rice world we've talked about. So we can ask about yields. What are the millet yields? And I'm not going to run you through all the math here because I'm probably over schedule already. But if we boil it down, we did a bunch of estimates of getting historical yield and ethnographic yields and trying to work out, like we did with rice, how many hectares per person, that kind of thing. Essentially, you end up with needing something like half a hectare per person per year in millet production. That means for 50 people, remember for 50 people of rice, you need about 8 hectares. For 50 people, if you're feeding them mainly millets, you need something like 30 to 36 hectares. So a lot more land. And of course, some of that land is probably under fallow in any one year. So this is a kind of wet rice model to support that small village. If everything is intensively managed for rice, you don't need that much agricultural land. For millets, maybe half of it is under cultivation and half of it is under fallow. You need a much more land. And these estimates, in fact, line up pretty well with what have been inferred from early written sources from more than 2,000 years ago as well, which come up with estimates of about 5 hectares for 8 people and things like that. Anyways, there are implications then for the nature of the way in which farming and farming populations spread. So if you have rice, you can feed more people. You need that labor anyways to produce the rice, and in a smaller land area. If populations are growing, they can support a higher population density. So it's a higher carrying capacity, if we borrow that terminology from ecology. Whereas with millets, you need more land, so you have a lower carrying capacity. So that means as populations grow, the millet farmers are going to reach their limits earlier, which means you're going to have to send some people off to find new land someplace else. So you get this, if we think of this, these are our carrying capacity, here's rice, here's millets. The millet guys are going to reach their limits 4 or 5 times before the rice guys reach their limit, assuming they have the same kind of curves of population growth. And that means millet farmers are going to be constantly looking for new land. They're going to be constantly sending out the 2nd and 3rd sons to go migrate over there and clear some more land because we need to feed more mouths. Whereas the rice farmers can invest that labor and stay put and increase population density. And we see that on the map. So this is a map of Neolithic cultures in China, named Neolithic cultures. Here's the Majabong and Songzhou cultures, which are the precursors of the Yangzhou in the lower Yangtze area. Here's the Dashi culture in the middle Yangtze. Here's the Yangshao and the Dawenkou. They're all roughly contemporary. These guys grow millets. They spread over huge areas, lots of cultural uniformity over large areas. That tells us that farmers and their cultures are migrating and they're looking for more land. The rice guys don't really have to spread. They can intensify in their wetlands. So it creates very different dynamics. And so that's the kind of contrast I would draw. So we have these different dynamics in terms of productivity, and those then lead on to other kind of cultural implications, but what we might think of as affordances, things that they afford things to do. So the rice farmers I would characterize as these entrenched wetland engineers. They're constantly investing more labor into modifying the landscape, embankments, dams, irrigation, etc. And what we might call land desk investment. So they're investing labor in transforming the landscape, and then the agriculture itself requires a lot of labor. On the other hand, the kind of millet strategy is to diversify, to rotate crops, and to expand, to find more land. Now there is some evidence for intensification through manuring, and there's some emerging evidence that some of these sites are developing a culture of using pig manure into the millet fields. This is mainly in the peripheral regions, and I think it's a kind of something that eventually emerges, but even so, it's never gonna have the same kind of productivity that rice does. So there's always a kind of quest for more land. If we think about agricultural increasing production, you can increase production through intensification, more labor per unit of land, through land desk intensification, so improving the nature of the land. These are the things that are happening in the rice world, whereas you can also innovate through diversifying, adopting new crops, and increase production by just having more land. And those are the strategies that are happening in the millet world. And so we have these very different strategies over the long term. And again, this is, if you look at, again, early sources, again, this is the Joe Lee book, The Rights of Joe, which again is supposed to be a Bronze Age text, but it's written down in the sixth century or it's copied down by people like Mencius and Confucius and so forth. It doesn't talk much about rice, but when it does talk about rice, it talks about how much work it is. They have to invest in reservoirs and embankments and canals and ditches and sluices. So that's all that land desk capital investment. And they have to clear weeds and use water to eliminate weeds and drain stagnant water and so forth. So there's a lot, it just talks about this investment in the landscape and the amount of labor that goes into rice. So there's a sense in which that's already, as we've seen, embedded since the Neolithic in that world. And so we have very different trajectories. So the third implication of the difference between millet and rice is, if we again go back to the beginning of the domestication, is the amount in which these things improve through domestication. So what is the inherent productivity from the wild form to the domesticated form? Again, I'm not going to go through the numbers. We kind of worked out sort of estimates of the different genetic changes and morphological changes that take place during domestication and what that does to increase the productivity. But it's the bottom line numbers. So a kind of minimum estimate of the increase in yield of rice just because of the changes that come about as domestication, not including all the intensification work that people put into it, is an increase of about 366% per plant. This is for Panica millet, about 550%, and over 1,100% for foxtail millet. So that means the wild ancestors are not very worthwhile. As they get domesticated, they increase in value a lot. So you get these very different trajectories in terms of the feedback of the domestication process in terms of increasing productivity in these different crops. So that I think creates a kind of different domestication dynamic. And so again, we can think about how the agriculture began quite differently. So this graph here just tries to look at the land area you need under wet rice and millets to feed 50 people. We've already looked at that. If we imaginatively de-domesticate them, remove the domestication traits, this is how much land you would need for wild rice versus the wild millet. So massive amounts of land, and nobody in the pre-Neolithic is harvesting 400 hectares of wild millet. So that tells us that millet could only have started as a small supplement to a lifestyle, not as a focus, whereas wild rice could become quite focused. So that sets up these different styles really right from the beginning. So I'm going to conclude here because I know I've run too long. So what are the conclusions? So the big conclusion, the take-home message is there's no one kind of Neolithic revolution. There's no one kind of origins of agriculture. There's alternative kinds of Neolithic. The Neolithic is a transformative epoch that takes mobile hunter-gatherer societies and turns them into ecosystem engineers to varying degrees, where they're co-evolving with certain plants and animals or modifying the landscape. It's the beginning of what we might think of as kind of Anthropocene processes today, right? It goes back to the Neolithic, but it happens in different ways in different places. And we get these two really contrasting cases in China. We have a kind of rice Neolicity, a logic of entrenched investment in the wetlands and in rice and in engineering. And that leads to a focus on labor coordination over large groups of people. That's what ultimately underpins hierarchy in these regions. And there's a value, when you look at those sites like Liangzhu, there's a real value in labor-intensive crafts, the carved jades, the fine ceramics. That's kind of valuing the labor that's gone into those things, labor which is supported by all that extra agricultural surplus. So then you can put that into investing labor into other things. If we look at the north, the Neolicity, the logic of the millet Neolithic is about really expansive adopters. They're constantly looking for new land, they're looking for new crops to try out, they're looking for new crop rotations, they're domesticating pigs, they're integrating dogs into their cultivation systems. And so there's a kind of flexibility and mobility that's built into it. Domestication and that great improvement in the millet allows them to settle down. Pigs and dogs also play into that. They're not as mobile. Pigs certainly are not. But there's a kind of recurrent expansion. We see that on the map into marginal lands. We haven't had time to talk about it, but we also see in North China is in the Neolithic is a massive deforestation in pollen diagrams. So large-scale deforestation, erosion as a result of that. So there's a kind of unintended consequences there. There's a kind of constant competition for space and a sense that when we get hierarchical societies in the early states, they're always interested, they're kind of multi-resource, multi-regional systems where they're moving stuff around, jade and stone axes and bronzes and salt and ivory. There's a kind of nested hierarchy of regions where they're always interacting and they're kind of always competing for space. Often the classical Chinese texts talk about the 5 crops of the north, so that that's kind of, again, embedded in their perception as it's written down of these kind of diversified landscapes. Okay, I will stop there. Thank you. Thank you.